The marble floors of the Palatine Hill were designed to echo the footsteps of gods. But in the middle of the 1st century, they echoed only with the terrified whispers of the Roman Senate. To understand the unique, suffocating horror of the reign of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, the man history remembers with the trembling nickname Caligula, one must first understand that his madness was not an accident. It was a meticulously crafted weapon, forged in the fires of trauma and sharpened on the whetstone of absolute, unchecked power. We often look back at the Roman Empire as the pinnacle of civilization, a beacon of law and order. Yet beneath the veneer of Stoic philosophy and white togas, there existed a darkness so profound, so depraved, that it threatens to blot out the light of Rome entirely. This is not merely a story of a bad king. It is a chronicle of a human soul completely corroded by vice, a man who looked into the abyss of human desire and decided to build his throne there. To speak of Caligula's atrocities, particularly those of a sexual nature, is to speak of a terror that transcended simple lust. For Caligula, sex was not about pleasure. It was about power. It was about the total humiliation of his subjects, the dismantling of Roman dignity, and the assertion that he, and he alone, was a living god for whom all moral boundaries were obsolete. But this monster did not emerge from the womb fully formed. The seeds of this deviant harvest were sown years before he ever donned the purple imperial robes. To understand the predator he became, we must look to the island of Capri, a jagged rock jutting out of the Tyrrhenian Sea, where the young Gaius spent his formative years as a prisoner in all but name. Capri was the retirement home of the Emperor Tiberius, a man whose own soul had long since withered into paranoia and perversion. The young Caligula, still a boy, was summoned there to live with the man who had likely murdered his father, the beloved general Germanicus, and starved his mother and brothers to death in rocky dungeons. Imagine the psychological fracture that occurs in the mind of a teenager forced to smile at the murderer of his family, forced to clap for the man who destroyed his lineage. It was on Capri that Caligula learned the most dangerous lesson of his life. Morality is a lie told by the weak to protect themselves from the strong. The historians Suetonius and Tacitus paint a picture of Capri that resembles a fever dream of debauchery. Tiberius had turned the island into a private observatory of vice. The old emperor had gathered from all over the empire girls and boys of noble birth, designated as spintriae, who were trained to perform sexual acts in triple chains before the aging ruler's eyes, hoping to revive his failing libido. The young Caligula watched. He watched the degradation of the human form. He watched how fear could force the proudest aristocrat to beg. He learned to hide his own feelings behind a mask of impenetrable obsequiousness. He became an unparalleled actor, showing no sorrow for his slaughtered family and no anger toward their executioner. He was the perfect observer, absorbing the toxicity of Capri into his very marrow. As the historian Suetonius famously wrote, "Never was there a better servant nor a worse master. It was here, amidst the grottos and the cliffs where victims were thrown into the sea, that Caligula's understanding of intimacy was shattered. He learned that the body of another person was merely a toy to be used and discarded. He saw that the emperor could take anyone, a senator's wife, a soldier's son, a visiting dignitary, and use them until they were broken. In this crucible of perversion, the little boots, the nickname given to him by his father's soldiers, began to rot from the inside out. He began to indulge in the nightlife of the island, wearing disguises to visit the lowest taverns and brothels, seeking out the grime that lay beneath the surface of Roman society. But on Capri, these were just the secret habits of a prince in waiting. The world had no idea what was brewing behind his cold, dead eyes. When Tiberius finally died, suffocated, rumor has it, by Caligula's own hand or by his ally, Macro, the world exhaled. The nightmare of the old tyrant was over. Caligula ascended to the throne in a wave of euphoria that swept across the empire. They called him their star, their chick, their baby. 160,000 victims were sacrificed in thanksgiving for his accession. The people remembered his father, Germanicus, and projected all their hopes onto the son. They believed they were entering a new golden age of justice and youthful vigor. For the first few months, Caligula played the part perfectly. He recalled exiles. He burned the records of treason trials. He staged lavish games. Rome fell in love with him. But this was the cruelest trick of all. It was the calm before a storm of blood and semen that would drown the city. 7 months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. He spent weeks hovering between life and death, drifting in a delirium of high fevers. The entire empire paused. Crowds slept outside the palace, praying to the gods to spare their beloved emperor. When he finally woke, the man who opened his eyes was not the man who had closed them. The brain fever, as it was called, had burned away the last remnants of his inhibition. The mask he had worn on Capri cracked and fell away, revealing the true face of the monster beneath. Some historians speculate it was encephalitis. Others claim it was the sheer intoxication of absolute power, realizing it had no limits. Whatever the medical cause, the result was a terrifying shift in personality. He began to look at the people around him, his sisters, the wives of his friends, the daughters of the Senate, and he no longer saw people. He saw property. He saw vessels for his amusement. The lessons of Capri came rushing back, but now there was no Tiberius to fear. He was Tiberius now. He was the master of the cliff. The first sign of the sexual terror to come was not directed at a stranger, but at the very sanctity of his own bloodline. The rumors had whispered about it for years, but now it became a brazen public spectacle. He turned his gaze toward his sisters, Agrippina, Julia Livilla, and his favorite Drusilla. In the eyes of Rome, incest was a deep, archaic taboo, a pollution of the family unit that invited the wrath of the gods. To Caligula, these laws were for mortals, and he was rapidly coming to the conclusion that he was something far more than mortal. He began to treat Drusilla not as a sister, but as a lawful wife. He paraded her through the palace, violating the most fundamental taboos of Roman society with a smirk. It was a test. He was testing the waters to see if the lightning bolts of Jupiter would strike him down. When they didn't, when the sky remained clear and the Senate remained silent, bowing and scraping before him, Caligula came to a horrifying realization. There were no consequences. He could do anything. The social contract that held Rome together, the idea that the emperor was the first citizen, bound by duty and tradition, was an illusion. He was a wolf in a pen of sheep, and the sheep were too terrified to bleat. This incestuous beginning was merely the prologue. Having broken the sacred bond of family, he turned his eyes outward, toward the aristocracy that despised him. He realized that sex could be used as a weapon of political domination. To sleep with a senator's wife was not just an act of lust. It was an act of conquest. It was a way to say, I own your lineage. I own your honor. I own you. The banquets of the Palatine Hill, once solemn affairs of state, began to transform. The heavy wooden doors would close, trapping the elite inside with a man whose moods shifted like the wind. The air would grow thick with tension. He would walk among the couches where the senators and their wives reclined for dinner. He wasn't just the host. He was the predator examining the livestock. Suetonius tells us he would slowly inspect the women as they ate, lifting their chins with his hand if they tried to look away, forcing them to meet his gaze. He would discuss their physical attributes loudly, critiquing them like cattle at a market, stripping them of their dignity before he had even touched them. The husbands, men who commanded legions and governed provinces, sat in frozen silence, staring at their wine cups, terrified that a single word of protest would mean a death sentence, not just for them, but for their entire families. This was the opening act of the nightmare. The Golden Age had dissolved into a grim twilight of uncertainty. The emperor was mad. He was insatiable, and he had just realized that the entire Roman Empire was nothing more than his personal harem. The atrocities were about to begin in earnest, and they would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. If the private incest with his sisters was a testing of the waters, the public desecration of Rome's noble wives was the flood that followed. The terror of the Palatine banquets evolved from mere visual inspection into active physical predation. It was here that the formula of Caligula's tyranny truly solidified: the deliberate destruction of the private sphere. In Rome, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held absolute authority over his family. By seizing the wives of these powerful men in plain sight, Caligula was not just satisfying a carnal urge. He was stripping the senators of their manhood and their authority, reducing them to helpless spectators in the tragedy of their own lives. The ancient sources, particularly Suetonius, describe a ritual of humiliation that became terrifyingly routine. During these lavish state dinners, while the wine flowed and the music played, Caligula would make his selection. He would rise from his couch and signal to a senator's wife, a woman perhaps distinguished by her virtue, her lineage, or simply her proximity. There was no courting, no seduction, merely a command. He would lead her away from the table, dragging her into an adjoining chamber, while her husband lay frozen on his couch, staring straight ahead, forced to engage in polite conversation with his neighbors, while the sounds of his wife's violation drifted through the heavy curtains. But the horror did not end with the act itself. The true psychological torture came afterwards. Caligula would return to the banquet hall, his toga disheveled, the woman following behind him in tears or in a state of shock. He would then recline back onto his couch, and as if discussing the quality of the wine or the tenderness of the roast boar, he would loudly critique the woman's performance. He would detail her body, her flaws, her enthusiasm, or her reluctance, listing the intimate details of the sexual encounter to the entire room. The husband had to listen. To react, show anger. To weep, to leave, was treason. The Senate was forced to applaud the rapist of their wives. In this way, Caligula turned the Roman aristocracy into a collection of willing cuckolds, complicit in their own degradation through their silence. This insatiable need to dominate extended beyond the dinner table to the very institution of marriage itself. Caligula seemed offended by the idea that any woman could belong to anyone but him. He treated marriage vows as a personal insult, a challenge to his ownership of all things Roman. This was most vividly illustrated in the tragedy of Livia Orestilla. Orestilla was a woman of high nobility, engaged to Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a prominent and wealthy aristocrat. The wedding was the social event of the season, a union of two great houses. Caligula, with his charming, wolfish grin, graciously accepted the invitation to attend the nuptials. The ceremony was underway. The sacred vows were being exchanged, and the guests were celebrating the union. But as the festivities continued, Caligula decided that he liked the look of the bride. He watched her across the room, his desire curdling into a twisted sense of entitlement. According to the historian Dio Cassius, Caligula turned to the groom Piso, who was reclining next to him, and whispered a command that chilled the blood. "Do not touch my wife." In a single breath, he dissolved the union. He halted the wedding, seized Livia Orestilla for himself, and declared that he was marrying her instantly. He justified this madness with a sneering historical reference, claiming he was taking a wife in the manner of Romulus and Augustus seizing women by force as a rite of conquest. He dragged the bride from her own wedding feast to his bed. The cruelty of the act was compounded by his fickleness. After only a few days, the novelty of the stolen bride wore off. He divorced Orestilla, discarding her as easily as he had taken her. But he could not let her go. Paranoia, the twin brother of his perversion, whispered that she might return to her original lover. He suspected that she and Piso might pine for one another. In a final act of spite, he banished both of them to separate, distant islands for the crime of adultery. Accusing them of resuming their relationship after he had divorced her, he destroyed 2 lives, not because he loved Orestilla, but because he could not bear the thought of them finding happiness without his permission. This pattern repeated with Lalia Paulina, a woman renowned not for her personality, but for her immense wealth and lineage. Caligula was reportedly in a province when he heard someone mention that Paulini's grandmother had been a famous beauty. That passing comment was enough to seal her fate. He decided he must possess the granddaughter of such a beauty. He sent orders to Rome, summoning Paulina to his side. She was already married to Memmius Regulus, a provincial governor. It didn't matter. Caligula forced Regulus to divorce her and personally preside over the wedding of his ex-wife to the emperor. Like Orestilla, Paulina's time in the imperial bed was short-lived. Caligula tired of her quickly, divorcing her on the grounds of infertility. But again, a grim aftermath followed. He forbade her from ever sleeping with another man, effectively sentencing her to a life of enforced chastity and loneliness, guarding a body that he no longer wanted but refused to let anyone else have. These incidents reveal the terrifying logic of his sexual atrocities. It was not chaotic. It was systematic. He was dismantling the social fabric of Rome, one marriage at a time. He was proving that the laws of gods and men stopped at the threshold of his desires. The Senate, once the rulers of the known world, and men who had conquered Carthage and Greece, were reduced to pimping out their wives to save their own skins. The atmosphere in Rome became suffocating. Every social interaction was a minefield. Fathers hid their daughters. Husbands sent their wives to country estates, hoping the emperor's gaze would not fall upon them. But Caligula's appetite was growing, and the supply of aristocratic women was beginning to bore him. He needed something more transgressive, something that would further blur the lines between the emperor and the gutter. He began to look beyond the nobility, turning his eyes toward the one place where sex was a transaction and depravity was a profession. He looked to the brothels, and he decided to bring the brothel to the palace. The walls of the Palatine were about to witness a descent into madness that would make the dinner party rapes seem almost decorous by comparison. He was about to open the doors of the imperial household to the public, turning the seat of government into a grand, grotesque marketplace of flesh. The golden age was dead. The age of the imperial bordello had begun. Having shattered the sanctity of the aristocratic home, Caligula now turned his destructive gaze toward the physical seat of Roman power itself, the Palatine Palace. To the Roman mind, the Domus Augustana was more than just a residence. It was a sacred space, the heart of the empire, where decisions affecting millions were made with stoic gravity. Caligula, driven by an insatiable need to defile everything that Rome held dear, decided to transform this temple of power into a monument of commerce and flesh. He was no longer content with merely acting like a beast in private. He wanted to institutionalize his depravity, to force the entire city to participate in his grotesque theater of humiliation. The ancient sources detail an act so brazen that it seems almost fictitious in its audacity. According to Suetonius, Caligula ordered a section of the imperial palace to be cleared and refurnished. Partitions were erected, small chambers were created, and the austere marble halls were draped in the gaudy, heavy fabrics of a Suburra whorehouse. He was building a brothel right under the nose of Jupiter Capitolinus. But the true horror lay not in the architecture, but in the staff. He did not fill this bordello with slaves, bought from the markets of the East. That would have been too ordinary for a connoisseur of degradation like Caligula. Instead, he staffed his palace brothel with the sons and daughters of the Roman nobility. Matrons of impeccable lineage, young men destined for the Senate, were dragged from their homes and forced into these cubicles to serve as prostitutes. Imagine the psychological violence of this act. These were people raised to believe they were the masters of the world. Now reduced to lowest status imaginable in Roman society, that of the Lino and the Meretrix, the pimp and the whore. Their pedigrees, once their proudest possessions, became mere advertising slogans for their imperial pimp. Caligula did not hide this operation in the shadows. He advertised it. He sent criers throughout the forums and the basilicas of Rome, inviting all citizens, commoners, freedmen and slaves alike, to come to the palace and partake in the pleasures he had provided. He wanted the lowest orders of society to defile the highest. It was a grand social leveling, a churning of the Roman hierarchy into a meaningless sludge of lust. He even turned it into a financial scheme, charging admission and lending money at usurious rates to those who couldn't afford the services, forcing them to sign contracts that effectively enslaved them to the imperial treasury. He kept meticulous records of who attended, praising those who spent lavishly as friends of the Caesar, and marking those who abstained as enemies. The message was clear. Participation in his filth was now a civic duty. While he was forcing the nobility into the gutter, Caligula himself was diving headfirst into it, seeking companionship among the very lowest classes of Roman society, the performers of the arena and the stage. In the rigid Roman social structure, gladiators, charioteers, and actors were considered infamous. They had no legal standing. They were seen as beneath contempt, purveyors of fake emotions and base violence. Yet it was here, among the sweat and blood of the ludus, that Caligula felt most at home. He found a kindred spirit in the artificiality and brutality of their worlds. His obsession with gladiators went beyond the typical fanatical support of a faction. He surrounded himself with these hulking killers, preferring their company to that of philosophers or generals. He took lovers from their ranks, most notoriously a Thracian gladiator whose brute strength fascinated the emperor. Caligula, who saw himself as a living god, felt a perverse thrill in submitting sexually to men who were technically slaves, men whose lives could be ended with a turn of his thumb in the arena. It was another inversion of the natural order, the master serving the slave, the god worshipping the beast. Even more scandalous to the conservative Roman elite was his relationship with the pantomime actor Nestor. Nestor was a superstar of the Roman stage, famed for his beauty and his ability to convey complex emotions through dance and gesture. Caligula's infatuation with him was total and violently possessive. They were lovers, a fact that Caligula flaunted with bizarre aggression. He would attend Nestor's performances and sit in the imperial box, watching like a hawk. If any member of the audience made the slightest noise during Nestor's dance, a cough, a sneeze, a whisper, Caligula would have the offender dragged from their seat and personally whip them with his own hands. The historian Suetonius recounts a chilling anecdote that illustrates the depth of this twisted devotion. Caligula would often kiss Nestor in open court, a shocking breach of protocol. On one occasion, while embracing the actor, Caligula lovingly placed his hand around Nestor's elegant neck and whispered with a giggle that as beautiful as that neck was, he could order it to be severed at any moment he chose. Even in his deepest moments of affection, the threat of arbitrary violence was never far away. Love and death were inextricably linked in his fractured mind. By this point in his reign, the distinction between reality and performance had completely collapsed for Caligula. He was no longer just watching the show. He was the show. The palace was a brothel. The Senate was an audience of terrified captives. And the emperor was the lead actor in a tragedy he was writing in real time. The city was drowning in a toxic mixture of fear and enforced hedonism. Yet, amidst all this chaos, Caligula was still searching for something, a partner who could truly match his level of madness, someone who wouldn't just endure his atrocities, but actively participate in them. He was about to find her, and their union would usher in the final, most grotesque chapter of his psychosexual reign of terror. By the third year of his reign, Caligula had exhausted the pleasures of the conventional world. He had defiled the innocent, corrupted the noble, and prostituted the dignified. The beds of the Palatine had seen a revolving door of Rome's most beautiful women, snatched from their husbands and discarded like apple cores. But beauty had begun to bore him. Innocence was too fragile. It broke too easily under his grip. The emperor found himself alone in his madness, surrounded by victims but lacking a partner. He needed a soul that was as scarred and twisted as his own, someone who didn't need to be broken because they were already shattered. He found this dark reflection in Milonia Caesonia. To the Roman public, the match was incomprehensible. Caesonia was the antithesis of the imperial ideal. She was not a blushing virgin or a prestigious aristocrat in the prime of youth. Suetonius describes her with brutal frankness. She was neither beautiful nor young. She was a woman in her 30s, already the mother of 3 daughters by another man, and possessed a reputation for reckless promiscuity that would have shamed a common streetwalker. Yet, it was precisely this vulgarity that intoxicated Caligula. In her, he saw a mirror. He saw a woman who had rejected the suffocating rules of Roman virtue, a woman who lived for the visceral, immediate gratification of her impulses. He didn't just marry her. He worshipped her depravity. Their union was less a marriage and more a collision of 2 volatile substances. The ancient historians whisper that Caesonia maintained her hold over the emperor through dark arts. Juvenal, the satirist, famously accused her of feeding Caligula a hippomans, a potent, madness-inducing love potion brewed from the forehead of a foal. He suggests that the final screaming insanity of Caligula's last year was chemically induced by this sorcerer wife, who poisoned his mind to enslave his heart. Whether it was magic, poison, or simply a shared pathology, their bond was absolute. Caligula's treatment of Caesonia revealed the grotesque nature of his affection. He did not cherish her modesty. He obliterated it. He treated her not as an empress, but as a prize exhibit in his gallery of horrors. He would frequently parade her alongside his troops, dressed in a soldier's cloak, helmet, and shield, sexualizing the very symbol of Roman military might. But among his inner circle of friends, he went further. He would force Caesonia to strip naked and walk before them, inviting them to inspect the body of the empress. This was not the sharing of a wife. It was a demonstration of total power. He was showing them that the highest woman in the empire was nothing more than meat to be displayed at his whim. Even in his moments of deepest passion, the shadow of the executioner loomed over their bed. Suetonius records a chilling intimate habit of the emperor, while fondling Caesonia, the neck of the woman he supposedly loved more than any other. He would whisper, and this beautiful throat would be cut as soon as I gave the order. He was tormented by his own feelings, obsessed with understanding why he was so drawn to her. He famously threatened to have her tortured on the rack, not because she had done anything wrong, but because he wanted to force her to confess the secret of her hold over him. He wanted to torture the truth out of his own wife to satisfy his curiosity about his own emotions. The fruit of this toxic union was a daughter, born just 1 month after their wedding. Caligula named her Julia Drusilla, resurrecting the name of his beloved incestuous sister. If Rome hoped that fatherhood would soften the monster, they were gravely mistaken. The child became a prop in his theater of cruelty. He carried the infant to the temples of the goddesses, placing her in the lap of Minerva and demanding that the goddess of wisdom nurse his spawn. But it was the child's behavior that delighted him most. Caligula would proudly show the baby to the horrified court, pointing out her violent temperament. He claimed that her paternity was undeniable because even as an infant, she would try to scratch the faces and gouge out the eyes of other children she played with. To a normal father, this would be a source of concern. To Caligula, it was proof of her divine, predatory blood. "She is wholeheartedly mine," he would declare, seeing the savage instinct of a wild animal in the cradle and calling it legacy. He was breeding a dynasty of wolves. With his domestic life now a solidified monument of vice, Caligula's madness began to expand vertically. He had conquered every human boundary law, family, marriage, gender. There was only one barrier left to break, the barrier between man and God. The sexual atrocities began to take on a theological dimension. He was no longer content with being the master of men. He demanded to be the peer of the Olympians. This self-deification manifested in bizarre, transgressive sexual displays. He began to dress in the guise of gods, appearing in public with the trident of Neptune or the thunderbolt of Jupiter. But his depravity knew no gender. He would frequently appear dressed as Venus, the goddess of love. He would don the embroidered robes of a woman, paint his face, and wear wigs, demanding to be worshipped as the female embodiment of desire. This was more than just cross-dressing. It was a ritualistic assertion that he encompassed all forms of being. Male and female, human and divine, nothing was outside of his nature. He ordered the heads removed from the statues of the gods in the temples Jupiter, Mercury, Apollo, and replaced them with his own likeness. He established a priesthood in his own honor, a grotesque mockery of religion, where the wealthiest citizens of Rome were forced to pay millions of sesterces for the privilege of being a priest of Caligula. And who was the high priest of this cult? Caligula himself. He worshipped himself, offering sacrifices of flamingos, peacocks, and guinea fowl to his own image. He even appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a priest, adding a layer of absurdity to the blasphemy. The sexual element of this godhood was implicit and terrifying. If he was a god, then all mortals existed for his use. The sacred virgins, the Vestals, were no longer safe. The wives of the gods were no longer safe. He claimed to have conversations with Jupiter Capitolinus, sometimes whispering in the statue's ear, sometimes shouting at it, threatening to beat the king of gods if he didn't obey. He claimed that the moon goddess, Luna, came down to sleep in his bed at night. He was hallucinating a cosmic harem, believing that the celestial bodies themselves were his concubines. The atmosphere in the palace had shifted from fear to a surreal waking nightmare. There was no logic left, no rules to follow to ensure survival. The emperor was a god or a cross-dressing deity who might demand a sacrifice or a sexual act at any moment. The Senate looked on in paralyzed horror as the man who held the power of life and death over the known world descended into a fantasy world where he was the only real being in existence. But reality has a way of asserting itself, even against gods. The terror he had inflicted on the specific individuals around him, the humiliations, the rapes, the casual threats of beheading, was coalescing into something dangerous. He had pushed the Praetorian Guard, his own protectors, too far. He had mocked their masculinity one too many times. The stage was being set for the final act of this tragedy. The blood that had been spilled in the bedrooms and the torture chambers was about to be answered by the steel of the assassin as dagger. The beast had cornered himself in his own labyrinth. While Caligula was busy redesigning the heavens and populating his bed with the reluctant wives of the Senate, a different kind of rot was spreading through the corridors of the Palatine. It was a rot born not of lust, but of hatred cold, hard hatred that grew in the hearts of the men charged with keeping the monster alive. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who stood watch while the emperor slept, the men who held the steel that separated the god from the mob, were beginning to realize a terrifying truth. The greatest danger to their lives was not an assassin from the outside, but the man they were sworn to protect. Caligula's mistake was fatal, and it was rooted in the same sexual pathology that had defined his entire reign. He believed that his power was so absolute that he could sexually humiliate not just the weak, but the strong. He forgot that a soldier's honor, his virtues, was the core of his identity. To strip a Roman soldier of his masculinity was to make him an enemy, and Caligula, blinded by his own brilliance, decided to make a plaything of the wrong man. Enter Cassius Chaerea. He was a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a relic of a bygone era. Chaerea was an old soldier, a man of grit and scars, who had served under Caligula's father, the great Germanicus, on the frozen frontiers of the Rhine. He was the embodiment of Roman martial discipline, stoic, loyal, and aging. But nature had played a cruel trick on this warrior. He possessed a voice that was high-pitched, soft, and to the ears of the emperor, laughably effeminate. For Caligula, who delighted in finding the raw nerve of every human being and pressing down, Chaerea became a favorite target. But the emperor's bullying was not merely schoolyard teasing. It was a systematic campaign of sexual degradation performed in front of the entire court. Caligula turned the daily routine of military protocol into a lewd comedy. Every day, the tribune on duty had to approach the emperor to receive the watchword, the password that would be used by the guards for that night. It was a solemn military ritual, a transfer of trust. When Chaerea came for the word, Caligula would not give him a term like victory or Jupiter or Rome. Instead, with a sneer of contempt, the emperor would whisper words like Priapus, the rustic god of eternal erections, or Venus, the goddess of love, or other obscenities usually reserved for the lowest brothels. Imagine the scene: the veteran soldier, standing stiff at attention in his armor, forced to repeat a word that branded him a sexual deviant or a woman, while the court tittered in the background. Caligula was using the language of sex to strip the armor off his protector. But the humiliation went further. When Chaerea would extend his hand to kiss the imperial ring, a sign of fealty, Caligula would often form his hand into an obscene shape, mimicking a phallus, and wave it in the old soldier's face, demanding he kiss that instead. Or he would wiggle his middle finger, a gesture known in Rome as the digitus imputicus, the impudent finger, suggesting that the tribune should perform a sexual act upon him. For months, Chaerea endured this. He took the watchword Priapus, he took the Venus, he took the obscene gestures. But inside the old soldier, the discipline was cracking. Caligula had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought that by feminizing Chaerea, he was rendering him harmless. He believed that a man treated like a woman would eventually act like one, submissive and weak. He failed to see that he was sharpening the blade that would kill him. He was turning a loyal dog into a cornered wolf. The atmosphere in the Praetorian camp became poisonous. The soldiers looked at their emperor and saw a madman who danced in slippers, slept with his sisters, and mocked the very men who kept him alive. The conspiracy began to coalesce, not in the grand meeting halls of the Senate, but in the dark corners of the guardrooms. It was a conspiracy of the terrified. Chaerea was not alone. The terror of Caligula's sexual whims had touched everyone. The list of conspirators grew to include powerful freedmen like Callistus, who had seen how easily Caligula discarded his favorites. They all knew the pattern. First the favor, then the sexual use, then the mockery, then the execution. They realized they were all just waiting for their turn on the chopping block. The logic of the assassination was simple: kill or be killed. The tension in Rome was palpable in January of 41 AD. The air was thick with bad omens. Lightning struck the Capitol. The statue of Jupiter burst into laughter during a sacrifice. The oracle at Antium warned Caligula to beware of Cassius, a warning the emperor laughably dismissed because he thought it referred to a different Cassius, oblivious to the man standing right behind him with a sword. The conspirators chose their moment carefully. The Palatine Games were approaching a festival of theater and performance instituted by Caligula himself. It was fitting. The emperor who lived his life as a performance would die at the theater. The plan was desperate. To kill an emperor in his own palace, surrounded by his German bodyguards, giants loyal only to him, was a suicide mission. But the humiliation of the watchwords had pushed Chaerea past the point of caring about survival. He wanted blood. He wanted to wash away the stain of Priapus with the red reality of murder. On the final day of the games, the 24th of January, the atmosphere was suffocating. Caligula was in a foul mood. He had spent the previous night partying and was suffering from a heaviness in his stomach, likely a hangover, combined with the gluttony of a late-night feast. He sat in the theater, watching a play that seemed to mirror the grim mood. The performance involved a robber chieftain who was crucified, and the stage was rigged to pour fake blood, flooding the set in a crimson tide. It was a grotesque tableau, a foreshadowing of the violence to come. As the noon hour approached, Caligula hesitated. He was tired. He debated whether to stay for the afternoon shows or go to the bathhouse to steam away his hangover and eat lunch. The conspirators watched him with bated breath. If he stayed in the public box, surrounded by the crowd, he was untouchable. They needed him in the narrow corridors, in the dark, transitional spaces of the palace. Fate intervened in the form of his uncle, Claudius, and other courtiers who urged him to go and refresh himself. With a reluctant groan, the god emperor rose from his seat. He pulled his toga around him and signaled his departure. He did not take the main route, where the crowds were thick. He chose a shortcut, a covered gallery, a cryptoporticus that ran beneath the palace complex. It was a narrow, dimly lit tunnel, the perfect choke point. Chaerea and the other conspirators slipped away from their positions, moving to intercept him. The trap was set. The man who had turned the empire into a brothel was walking unknowingly into the slaughterhouse. He was walking toward the very men he had spent years tormenting with his perverse sense of humor. He was about to learn that a sword, unlike a courtier, does not care if you call yourself a god. In that dark tunnel, the grim history of Caligula was about to reach its crescendo. The sexual atrocities, the incest, the rapes, the forced prostitution, all of it had built a pressure cooker of resentment that was about to explode. The last thing Caligula would see would not be the loving face of a subject or the fearful eyes of a victim, but the cold, hard stare of the man he had called a woman. The watchword for today would not be Venus. It would be strike. The cryptoporticus was a transitional space, a long, semi-subterranean corridor that connected the imperial palaces to the public theaters. On that January afternoon, it became the birth canal of a new era, but the birth was one of blood and iron. As Caligula stepped into the dim coolness of the tunnel, leaving the roar of the crowd behind him, he was walking out of history and into the grave. He was accompanied by a small retinue, including his uncle Claudius, the stuttering fool whom Caligula kept around for amusement, and a few slaves. But the shadows were lengthening, and the predators were closing in. In a moment of supreme irony, the emperor delayed his own death for the sake of art. He stopped in the corridor to inspect a troop of young noble boys from Asia, who had been brought to Rome to perform a complex Pyrrhic dance. Even with a hangover, even with the weight of the empire on his shoulders, Caligula could not resist the allure of the stage. He spoke to them, asking about their costumes, perhaps critiquing their posture. It was the final act of the director emperor. For a few seconds, he was just a connoisseur of performance, completely oblivious to the fact that the men standing just feet away were gripping the hilts of their daggers so tightly their knuckles were white. Cassius Chaerea made his move. He stepped forward, breaking the protocol of distance. Caligula, annoyed by the intrusion, perhaps expected another plea for money or a report on the games. According to some sources, Chaerea asked for the watchword one last time. Caligula, true to his nature to the very bitter end, is said to have sneered a final obscenity, perhaps Jupiter, referring to himself, or a final sexual insult. It was the last insult he would ever speak. Chaerea screamed, "Accipe radum, receive your due," and brought his sword down. The blow was clumsy, driven by rage rather than precision. It struck the emperor between the neck and the shoulder, slicing into the clavicle but missing the fatal artery. The god did not vanish in a puff of smoke. He did not smite his attacker with lightning. He crumbled. The illusion of divinity shattered instantly upon contact with cold steel. Caligula fell to his knees, clutching his wound, and screamed a phrase that echoes through history with chilling ambiguity. "I am still alive." Was it a cry for help? A statement of defiance? Or the confused realization of a madman who genuinely believed he could not die? It didn't matter. The spell was broken. Seeing the blood of the monster, the other conspirators swarmed like piranhas. The tribune Sabinus drove his dagger into the emperor's chest. Then the others fell upon him. It was not a sterile execution. It was a butchery. They hacked at him in a frenzy of released tension, their blades tearing through the purple robes that had symbolized his terror. Suetonius tells us he was stabbed 30 times. 30 times the metal pierced the flesh of the man who had raped the Senate. 30 times for the brothers he killed, the sisters he defiled, the men he tortured. As he writhed on the stone floor of the tunnel, the Emperor of Rome was reduced to a piece of meat, biting the dust in agony, his body convulsing until the final, gurgling silence descended. Genitals he had used as a weapon against Rome were notoriously hacked and mutilated. A final, grim message from the Praetorians. The phallus of the tyrant was severed. But violence, once unleashed, is a contagion. It does not stop with the guilty. The death of Caligula was only the opening movement of the purge. The conspirators knew that a dead emperor is only truly dead if his lineage dies with him. As long as his blood flowed in the veins of another, the ghost of Caligula could return. The grim logic of the coup demanded total erasure. While the German bodyguards, ferocious giants loyal only to the person of the emperor, arrived too late and began hacking innocent bystanders to pieces in a blind rage, a detachment of the assassins moved with icy purpose toward the private quarters of the palace. They were hunting the rest of the pack. They were coming for the sorceress and the monster child. They found Milonia Cassonia in the imperial apartment. The woman who had ridden alongside the emperor in armor, who had brewed the potions that poisoned his mind, who had watched him humiliate the wives of Rome, now faced the consequences of that power. History offers conflicting accounts of her final moments, but the most haunting version portrays her in a state of tragic acceptance. She did not flee. She did not beg. She looked at the centurion entering her room, sword drawn and dripping with her husband's blood, and she understood. Some say she blamed Caligula for not listening to her warnings. Others say she simply knelt. In a grotesque echo of the bedroom talk, Caligula used to whisper to her, "This beautiful throat would be cut as soon as I gave the order." Cassonia bared her neck to the assassin. She offered herself to the blade. The centurion did not hesitate. He drove the sword through her, ending the life of the most hated woman in Rome. Her body slumped to the floor, joining the wreckage of the dynasty. But the true horror, the act that cements this narrative as a tragedy of the blackest sort, was yet to come. The soldiers turned their eyes to the cradle. There lay Julia Drusilla, the infant daughter of Caligula. She was barely a toddler. In the eyes of the law, she was an innocent child. In the eyes of the conspirators, she was a seed. She was the spawn of the beast, and they believed that the madness of the father was a biological imperative in the child. They remembered how Caligula had bragged about her scratching the eyes of her playmates. They saw not a baby, but a monster in chrysalis. The brutality of what happened next is difficult to comprehend, but it is necessary to confront. There was no trial for Drusilla. There was no mercy. A soldier approached the crib. He did not use his sword. Perhaps he felt that steel was too dignified for the spawn of Caligula. He reached in, grabbed the screaming child by her feet, and swung her like a club. He smashed her head against the marble wall of the nursery. The silence that followed that sickening crack was the true end of Caligula's reign. In a matter of an hour, the golden age had dissolved into a pile of corpses. The husband butchered in a tunnel, the wife bled out on the floor, and the child's brains scattered on the nursery wall. The Iuli Claudi line, the blood of the great Augustus, had been polluted by madness and then purged by a violence that matched it. The conspirators left the palace, their sandals sticky with the blood of a family. They had saved Rome. They had restored liberty. But as they walked out into the sunlight of the Forum, leaving the carnage behind them, they left a vacuum. The Senate was paralyzed. The people were confused. And in the shadows of the palace, hiding behind a curtain, trembling in terror, was the old, stuttering Uncle Claudius. The soldiers would find him, not to kill him, but to hoist him onto their shoulders and proclaim him emperor. The nightmare of Caligula was over, but the lesson remained branded onto the soul of the eternal city. Rome had learned that a man could become a monster, and that the only cure for a monster is an atrocity. The sexual atrocities were not just a list of crimes. They were the steps of a staircase leading down into the abyss, an abyss that eventually swallowed the emperor himself. The story of Caligula is not a history of sex. It is a history of power devoid of humanity, and the terrible price that must be paid to reclaim it. The physical body of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was gone. It lay in a heap of bloody rags on the cold stone of the Cryptocorticus, a piece of refuse to be hastily cremated in a shallow grave on the Lamian Gardens, half-burnt and covered with turf. Stop the stray dogs from gnawing on the bones of a god. But the death of a monster does not end the nightmare. It merely changes the nature of the haunting. As the smoke of his funeral pyre drifted over the 7 hills, Rome was left to reckon with the wreckage of the human soul that Caligula had left behind. The immediate reaction of the Senate was one of performative outrage. They declared a damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory. This was the ultimate Roman punishment, a bureaucratic attempt to delete a human being from existence. They wanted to scrub the stain of Caligula from history. His name was chiseled off inscriptions, leaving jagged scars on the marble facades of temples. His statues were pulled down, their bronze melted to mint new coins, their marble faces recarved into the likeness of Claudius or Augustus. The coins bearing his image were gathered and defaced, the profile of the tyrant melted into formless lumps of metal. But you cannot legislate forgetfulness. You cannot pass a decree to unrape a mind or unmurder a child. The damnatio memoria failed because the trauma Caligula inflicted was not etched in stone, but in the psyche of a civilization. He had forced Rome to look into a mirror, and the image staring back was unbearable. The Senate hated him not just because he was cruel, but because he had exposed their own cowardice. He had shown the world that the proud Roman aristocracy, the descendants of Scipio and Cato, would prostitute their wives, sell their children, and debase themselves for a few more days of life. He had proven that their virtue was a costume that could be stripped away with a single threat. When we analyze the grim history of Caligula, we must look beyond the clinical diagnosis. Modern historians and doctors have spent centuries trying to pin a label on his madness. Was it encephalitis? Was it temporal lobe epilepsy? Was it hyperthyroidism or Wilson's disease? These attempts to medicalize his evil are, in a way, a defense mechanism. We want to believe it was a disease, a virus, something external that invaded his brain. It comforts us to think that his atrocities were the result of a brain fever, a biological accident. But the truth is far more terrifying. Caligula was not a victim of a virus. He was the victim of absolute, unchecked power. He was the product of a system that took a traumatized boy, raised him in the shark tank of Capri, gave him the power of a god, and told him there were no consequences. His sexual atrocities were not random spasms of insanity. They were the logical conclusion of a life lived without boundaries. He treated people like things because, in his world, that's what they were. The women, the men, the senators, the soldiers, they were all just props in his solipsistic play. The legacy of Caligula is the terrifying realization of what happens when the barrier between I want and I can is completely removed. Most human beings are restrained by law, by morality, by shame, or by the fear of others. Caligula had none of these. He stripped away the veneer of civilization to reveal the raw predatory ID beneath. He showed us that without these constraints, the human animal is capable of devouring its own kind with a smile. His short 4-year reign left a scar on the Roman consciousness that never fully healed. He changed the nature of the Principate. Before Caligula, there was still a pretense that the emperor was just the first citizen. After Caligula, the mask was off. Everyone knew that the emperor was a master, and the citizens were slaves. He paved the way for the madness of Nero, the cruelty of Domitian, the depravity of Elagabalus. He broke the seal on imperial excess. In the end, the ghost of Caligula lingers not in the histories of his building projects or his wars, but in the dark corners of human nature. He is the archetype of the tyrant who invades the most private sanctums of life, the bedroom, the marriage bed, the nursery. He represents the ultimate violation, the theft of the self. The haunting conclusion of this tragedy is found in the silence of the Lamian Gardens. It is said that before his sisters returned from exile to give him a proper burial, the ghost of Caligula haunted the spot where his half-burnt body lay. The keepers of the gardens spoke of sleepless nights, of spectral screams, of a presence that could not find rest. And perhaps he never has. As long as there are men who view power as a license to take, who view others as objects to be used, who confuse fear with respect and cruelty with strength, the spirit of Caligula is still alive. He is still alive, just as he screamed in the tunnel. He lives on in every abuse of power, in every act of sexual violence, in every moment where the strong devour the weak. The statues are gone, the coins are melted, but the monster remains. We look back at the Roman Empire and see the marble and the glory. But if you look closely, right there in the center, staining the white toga of history, is the blood of the Cryptoporticus. The lesson of Caligula is simple and devastating. There is no limit to the depths a human soul can sink when it convinces itself that it is a god.